Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. In this one, the Russians continue their Kursk counteroffensive stage 2. They are also advancing in the Kupiansk section of the front line, in the Pokrovsk section of the front line, and the Ukrainians kicked the Russians out of Kamyansky in the south. Starting out in the Kursk section of the front line, the Russians have significantly advanced by recapturing Olgovka as well as the forest patch just southeast of it. It is reported as soon as the Russians started advancing, the Ukrainians started withdrawing from Olgovka to avoid an encirclement. This was planned for a long time considering the dire situation the Ukrainian soldiers were in, but in the end they did not withdraw fast enough or fix the situation fast enough because now it has closed and the Ukrainians either withdrew under fire or whoever was left were encircled, as the Russians continued throwing troops along the main highway from Koronevo towards Sucha. In this advance, the Russians continued to push all the way towards Sheleny Shrach, where they now also have a foothold within Novo-Ivanovka, where heavy fighting is continuing in this area. The main Ukrainian forces are largely along the front lines where they are fighting against the Russian positions further north, and these positions are further away from the northern flank here or the western flank here where the Russians are conducting their counteroffensive. This means that there's no significant Ukrainian force here north of the current Russian counteroffensive, and the main force is in the southern parts where the Russians are now also with fire control over the exits from these frontline positions. What that means is, as someone asked in the comments in my last video, well, a couple of APCs landed in Sheleny Shrach. What does that mean for Rulgovka and Pokrovsky, Lyubomovka, and so on? It's simply 3 APCs at most, couple squads. The reason for this is once the first ones have gained a foothold, they're able to withstand some sort of counterattack and enable more troops to arrive. And once they set up their positions with their weapons and so on, they'll have firing positions on the withdrawal of any forces in and out of Ulgovka and Lyubimovka, hitting the supply lines or the withdrawal point of these units, which makes it very difficult to resupply or to exit these sort of positions. Now the Russians have been fighting over Lyubimovka for quite some time. They had a stalemate following the first initial push of the counteroffensive. That means that both forces were even in terms of what they could commit to this section of the front line while holding the other sections stable. But at some point, the Ukrainians had to send even more troops than what was allowed to Lyubimovka. This allowed for further Russian advances in the north. This then led to the continuation of the stalemate here by Lyubimovka and some pushes by the Ukrainians to regain some territory that they recently lost. Now, with this flanking maneuver by the Russians cutting off their supplies, the Ukrainians now have two choices. Either they stay and fight, where due to the lack of resupply, they'll eventually get overrun, or to break out from the attempted encirclement under fire by Russian forces, both the ones that they are fighting and the ones in the rear. And if they attempt such a breakout, then the Russians will attempt to overrun their positions by launching their own push, now that the defending force will be running away. Unless the Ukrainians are able to launch a counterattack and regain these positions, which seems unlikely considering that they were forced to withdraw from Ulgovka and the Russians are now expanding this flanking maneuver by fighting in the direction of Novo-Ivanivka. If the Russians are able to secure the positions here, push the Ukrainians out of this pocket along the river line and Lyubomivka, the entire area here, then the Russians will have enough forces to concentrate along the main road from Koronevo towards Sucha to launch another operation towards Sucha, this time with much stronger forces, now that they don't have to spread out their forces towards Lyubimovka, to capture Svetlikovo and Lebedivka, and then there will be nothing between the Russian positions and Sucha. Therefore, it is reported that the Ukrainians have already started withdrawing from Sucha. It is a limited withdrawal so far, But it is likely that if this push by the Russians succeed and they are managed to reach Stuttgart, then it will be the end of the Ukrainian Kursk offensive. So we're now, if this offensive push succeeds, just a few days/weeks away from the end of the Kursk offensive. So what everyone said, well, Ukraine has captured 1,000 square kilometers in 2 weeks. The Russians have captured that within a year. Well, correction, the Russians captured that within 2 months, and they are about to negate the Ukrainian Kursk offensive, which would double that in another month. And the difference is twofold. The first one is that the Russians captured heavily fortified positions with a geographical advantage to the Ukrainians, while the Ukrainians entered an open field with hardly any fortified positions. And the second part is that the Ukrainians spent a large amount of their elite forces, while the Russians, what did they really spend? We don't know the real numbers, but what we do know is that it is at a sustainable rate, considering they've been doing it for a year non-stop, their offensive operations. While the Ukrainians do it in bursts, the Russians do it sustainably. And that is the main difference between the Russian and Ukrainian operations, is that Russia does not do anything that they cannot sustain, while the Ukrainians consistently do something they cannot sustain. And this leads to the imbalance at the front line. The Ukrainians sometimes manage to achieve success with these short bursts of advances, but now that the Russians simply have an overwhelming force within Ukraine with a large amount of manpower available, compared today to the time the Ukrainians succeeded with the Kharkiv offensive, the Russians now have 3 to 4 times as many soldiers stationed within Ukraine. Moving on to the Kupiansk section of the front line, there are 2 advances by the Russians. The first one is west of Kislivka, where the Russians actually managed to capture some of the Ukrainian fortified positions in the area, which is this trench network. We can already see it in satellite imagery. This is one that was prepared to stop Russian advances along the main highway. And there are no other fortified positions all the way towards Petropavlivka, which are located and detected by open source intelligence. This secures the Russian hold over Kotlярivka and Kislivka, and will allow the Russians to flank Stepovo Novoselivka, capture that as well, and then push along towards Peshane, after that towards Petropavlivka. In the southern direction, the Russians captured the remaining parts on the eastern bank of the Serbis River line, allowing them full control of the Serbis River line here from the north, and all the way down south towards Nevske. They have full control of the eastern bank of the Serbis River line, which means that the Serbis River line front line is now just this short distance here from Nevske in the north to the Severodonetsk River line in the south. This allows the Russians to avoid spreading their forces out thinly, as they now need less forces to hold the river line positions. Instead, the Russians can focus and gather their forces in smaller areas, which will allow for breakthroughs across the river line, such as this one towards Vishneve, where they will attempt to gain control over the settlement and then push towards Borova, or even to concentrate more forces in the direction of Peshane to capture these 3 settlements of Lushkivka, Koslinikivka, and Krukliakivka, which opens up for a lot of developments. If the Russians focus their forces in the direction of Zinkove, for example, they may even attempt a crossing across the Uskar River line to flank Kupiansk from the south. It is unlikely that the Ukrainians have significant forces on the western bank of the Uskar River line, considering that their positions here really are focused around the Kursk direction, Kharkiv direction, Donetsk region, and Zaporizhia front, where there are frontline positions they need to cover for, while here in this section of the front line, the main forces are focused on the eastern bank of the Uskar River line to prevent the Russians from capturing the river bank. What I'm saying is that the Russians could attempt something similar to the Ukrainian Kharkiv offensive, where they managed to recapture a large section of the front line by overrunning the Russian forces with the riverbank area, allowing them to recapture positions such as Liman, Kupiansk. The Russians could repeat that by crossing the river line and doing a similar operation by pushing towards Kupiansk, flanking it towards Shevchenkove, and down south towards Izium, capturing the western bank of the Uskar River line would allow the Russians to ignore the entire eastern bank of it, where the majority of the Ukrainian forces are located. And they could combine that with an assault from the border area, and that is possible due to the fact that the Russians have more soldiers, therefore they can spread their forces out more. Further south, we see here in the direction of Pokrovsk that the Russians have managed to capture fortified positions here southwest of Mykolaiivka. This allows them to secure their positions here by Mykolaiivka, Krasnoyar, and Krychya to develop as offensive operations towards Mirnorad. As we see, the Russians have captured a lot of the fortified positions, but there are still some remaining under Ukrainian control. Therefore, the next targets of the Russians would be here northwest of Rodivka, and then towards the northwest of Mykolaiivka. Or it could potentially just be to push in the direction of Mirnorad and flank the Ukrainian positions there, limiting their supplies, and therefore forcing a withdrawal from these positions, allowing for a much cleaner capture of the area, and then push towards Mirnorad from both the eastern direction, southeastern direction, and southwestern direction along the railway lines. Further south in the direction of Kamyansk, the Ukrainians have managed to recapture the northern flank of the river line, and therefore it confirms my initial suspicions that this was an unsustainable assault, as there is no real possibility of secure supply lines, and it isn't really a well-positioned offensive operation. It's likely just a distraction to keep the Ukrainian forces here, to avoid them sending additional troops either to the Kursk direction or other sections of the front line, but to continue this idea that the Russians can launch an offensive operation in the Zaporizhzhia direction at any time. And that is all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.